Bree Stensrud here, and this video segment is about border security. We have lots of questions about how we can be a secure nation as well as a compassionate nation. And we're going to talk with Matthew Soerens at World Relief, who is the U.S. Mobilization Director of Churches and Advocacy. Matthew, thanks for joining us once again.
Yeah, I was happy to do this.
So, biggest question, are our borders secure?
Yeah, I mean, that's not really a yes or no question in that, of course, border security, I mean, that's like, is the suburb I live in secure? It's mostly secure. I feel safe most of the time. Does that mean there's never a crime? No, but it's decently secure. And I would say the same of our border. Our borders in the United States, and I think most people are especially talking about the U.S.-Mexico border, though it's not the only border we have. We have the Canadian border. We have water borders as well. But in terms of the southern border, it is far more secure today than it was 20 years ago. That's pretty much indisputable. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that we've nearly doubled the number of Border Patrol agents in that time period. There's now about 16 to 17,000 Border Patrol agents from the last data we have who are stationed along the U.S.-Mexico border. We have dramatically more than doubled the amount of funding, whether that's for physical barriers like walls and fencing, but also probably more effectively and more importantly, a lot of electronic surveillance tools along our border. It's also, if you look at the U.S.-Mexico border, there are a lot of just geographic, physical reasons that parts of the border are very difficult to cross unlawfully. That is to say, to cross without being inspected by the U.S. government. So it's not that no one ever gets across the border unlawfully, but the numbers of people doing so are down really dramatically from the peak of the mid 2000s. And I would say that's significantly an effect of border security, but it's also an effect of, well, first of all, in the late 2000s, we had a recession. That meant fewer people wanted to come to the United States because the reason to come was largely economic. And then the other thing that has happened is we've seen, actually the Mexican economy has had a decent decade or so. So we've seen a significant decline in the number of people from Mexico in particular coming to the United States unlawfully. That has also been paired with increased opportunities for lawful migration. So for temporary work visas, for example, all of that combines to the effect that there are far fewer people sneaking across the border undetected than 10 or 20 years ago.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of these, but what kind of measures are in place to secure the border?
Yeah, as I said, it's a pretty comprehensive mix of tools. So you have boots on the ground, Border Patrol agents, whose job is to apprehend anyone seeking to cross that border unlawfully, and in many cases to provide assistance, because some of those people have been walking for days in the desert, and then to process them under the terms of U.S. law. You have technology, you have drones, you have all sorts of electronic surveillance that's in place, some of which is proprietary. So I've met with Border Patrol agents and they basically can't tell me all the tools that are in their tool belts. But then there also are, of course, their security at ports of entry as well, because most people who come into the United States from Mexico don't come in unlawfully. They cross the border lawfully, but that doesn't mean they're not bringing something that they're not supposed to have with them, or that there's not opportunities for wrongdoing there as well. So there's a lot of tools, and again, a huge investment in taxpayer dollars in border security in the last 15 to 20 years.
So we obviously have the border wall. We've got drones, ground sensors. When I was meeting with Border Patrol, they talked about their staff that they have on horses and ATVs, and those that they have at ports of entry, and those that they have in between ports of entry driving in trucks. And so you've kind of this collective way in which, I mean, even when you think about the Rio Grande and some of the waterways that are there. So you've got Border Patrol and boats and all of those things. So there's just this collective toolbox that they have that they're using to keep the border safe. And so one question that we always get is the wall the safest way to secure the border? And I think you and I both have talked with Border Patrol, and they would say it's not always the safest way. I mean, it can be helpful in diverting people to a certain spot that makes it easier for them to cross or easier for them to be checked or inspected. Tell us a little bit about that. Is a wall the most secure way to provide safety along the border?
Yeah, I mean, I think most Border Patrol agents and most residents of border communities would say walls make sense, or even to say walls, sometimes it's really just a fence, but an effective fence. They have a purpose in some parts of the border. There's other parts of the border where it would make no sense whatsoever because the real purpose of a wall is not, I mean, if you're creative enough, you can get over a wall. I mean, the tool to do so is called a ladder. But that's certainly going to slow someone down dramatically. So you're not going to be able to get over, over a fence quickly enough that you could then kind of escape into a place where you couldn't be apprehended. So, for example, in an urban area like between San Diego and Tijuana, or El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, there's been fences and walls for quite a long time in those areas. And that's because, I mean, there's places you could cross from Juarez and into El Paso, and you'd be downtown El Paso and pretty easily could fit into a crowd, and it would be, it'd be hard for the Border Patrol to apprehend you. But if you cross in the middle of the desert, hours and hours from any sort of, civilization, it's actually going to be pretty straightforward that the Border Patrol will be able to apprehend you. So there's places where I think it makes sense. There's places where it does not make any sense at all. And it only makes sense as part of a comprehensive strategy for border security. And frankly, there's been a lot of push for, well, we need more wall. I think what we need more of is improvements and better technology at ports of entry, because that's really, in my view, where we've under-resourced the border security dynamic, is making sure that we're able to apprehend people bringing in things that they shouldn't be, or even people at ports of entry.
So that leads us into the next kind of part of this. And there's a lot of common misconceptions about border security and where things are happening along the border. And we are always talking about we can have secure borders, but also be a country that has compassionate and merciful treatment of those who are coming to our borders. So talk to us a little bit about how do we hold that tension well, because we think it's possible. And then what are the common misconceptions that kind of butt up against that?
Yeah, I so love the way you framed that, Bree, because I think too often in the United States, we get these sort of sound bites of, well, we need secure borders. No, we need to welcome immigrants, as if those ideas were opposed to one another. The reality is we could welcome people and be secure. And that's what we should do. That's what we should expect our government to do. It's a very appropriate expectation on our government to do everything reasonably possible to ensure that no one who would seek to harm the United States is able to get into the country. At the same time, we should have, I think immigration is wonderful for the United States. It's wonderful for the church in the United States. It's been a huge part of our economic growth. And I think we need immigration. We've benefited from it. So as much as we can make that a lawful process that is orderly, that's always going to be better than basically relying on people coming unlawfully and then using their labor. So we should be facilitating legal migration processes and making it appropriately difficult to try to come across the border unlawfully. That goes to one of the misconceptions that I think is important to understand. And this is a shift in the last several years. Our border security infrastructure was really built to stop people from sneaking into the country, which seems pretty obvious, right? Like that's what the Border Patrol is there to try to do. That's what a wall is there to try to do. But most of the people who are apprehended for unlawfully crossing the border in recent years were not trying to sneak into the country. They were trying to find the Border Patrol to request asylum. And that is because they claimed to have a credible fear of persecution on account of one of the reasons under the law. Now, some of them actually have very strong cases. Some of them don't actually have strong cases, but that they're not trying to sneak into the country. And part of that is it's very difficult to sneak into the country at this point. Our border security is quite strong. The Border Patrol will find you whether you're looking for them or not in most cases. But the reality is a lot of these are families, even unaccompanied children, who are looking for the Border Patrol. So the infrastructure we've set up, which was largely an infrastructure designed for single men kind of trying to come surreptitiously into the United States to find employment opportunities, is not working ideally for a situation where people are families with small kids who are trying to come in to request asylum, which, by the way, they could also do at the port of entry. And I think that would be preferable in a lot of ways. But in strange ways, we've discouraged people from coming to the ports of entry by making them wait for long periods of time. So more and more people have come out to the desert and crossed unlawfully, which is violating the law. It can be a misdemeanor offense. And yet it is still lawful to request asylum, no matter how you enter it. Section 208 of the asylum law is pretty clear on that. So that's one key misconception. Another misconception that I think is important is about drugs. I mean, a lot of people, when they hear about the border, their mind immediately goes to, that's how drugs come to the United States. Now, the first thing I would say on that is it's important to acknowledge why drugs come to the United States, which is that we consume them. We are a huge market for drugs. And if we weren't consuming drugs in this country, it would relieve so much harm to people in other parts of the world who are victims of a very dark industry. But some of those drugs do come to the United States from other parts of the world. Some of them come, frankly, through the U.S. Postal Service. I mean, there's people mail drugs from China, from other parts of the world. So there's all different areas where this is complicated. But when drugs come from the southern border, often coming up from South America through Central America, they are not usually coming across the unguarded border areas. They're not usually going over a border wall. They're coming in a vehicle through a port of entry or on a person through a port of entry. And usually not by foreign nationals, but by U.S. citizens who come, just like you or I would if we're visiting Mexico for the day. We'd come in, we'd show our passport and say, welcome back to the United States. And it's frankly difficult to make sure that someone isn't carrying drugs on them or doesn't have drugs somewhere in their vehicle. And the reality is the vast majority, especially of like hard drugs, so kind of accepting marijuana, but like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, other hard drugs, the vast majority of those that are apprehended, well more than 80%, are being apprehended at ports of entry by Customs and Border Protection officers, not by the Border Patrol between the ports of entry. So that to me suggests that where we need to increase our capacity is actually at ports of entry to do a better job of apprehending those drugs coming illicitly into the United States.
So Matt, I think another common misconception that we should address is probably the human trafficking conversation, which is different than human smuggling. And I think some people kind of use those interchangeably. So let's kind of dissect that a little bit and talk about what's really true about that dynamic at the border.
Yeah, I appreciate you noting that distinction, Bree, because I think it's confusing for a lot of people. So I think one of the most helpful way for me to think about this is that human trafficking is a crime against a person. Human smuggling is a crime against the state. So the victim of human trafficking is a person, a woman, a man, a child who has been forced to work either in a labor role or in a commercial sex role under force, fraud, or coercion. It doesn't in itself, to be convicted of being a human trafficker, you do not have had to have transported someone at all. You don't have to cross an international boundary. It's all about that force, fraud, or coercion, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Human smuggling is bringing someone unlawfully across the border. So it's a crime against the state. It doesn't mean that those concepts are unrelated, because sometimes someone who is a smuggler, or what's sometimes called a coyote, could also end up being a trafficker. I mean, there are some unethical, unscrupulous people in that criminal enterprise who will tell people, well, now that I've gotten you this far, if you want to be released, you need to work for me in this restaurant. Or, if you don't want me to go back and kill your relatives back in your country of origin, you need to be prostituted and, made a victim of sex trafficking. So that does happen, but they're not synonymous. That doesn't happen in all cases where someone has, paid someone to bring them unlawfully into the country. And I would say one of the best ways that we could end the human smuggling industry is to have robust, functional, legal immigration processes. Nobody wants to pay $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 to a coyote when they could go apply for a visa and buy an airplane ticket for a fraction of that cost. And when we actually benefit from those people ultimately arriving in the United States and playing a really integral role in our labor market as essential workers, in agriculture, in healthcare, in so many different parts of our economy, our view of World Relief has always been, let's increase legal immigration, not without limit, but to a level that meets the needs of our labor markets, that lets families be together, that protects those who are persecuted. And then we can do all we can to make it very, very difficult to bring someone unlawfully across the border.
Okay, that's good. That's really good. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to ask you is, a lot of people think that those who are in this country, the 11 million number that everyone kind of throws around, those are the estimates, that those who are here illegally without status, that they cross the border to do so, which makes people very nervous about border security. But the reality is most of those folks who are here without status didn't cross the border illegally, correct?
Well, it's just about half and half, yeah. So roughly half, and depending on your estimates of those 11 million people crossed the border unlawfully, but the other half entered lawfully. Most of the time on an airplane with a tourist visa or a student visa or some other visa that had a temporary restriction on it that person overstayed. They didn't go back when they were supposed to. And that's also why, by the way, people I think associate undocumented immigrants or immigrants in the country illegally with the country of Mexico, Well, that is roughly half of undocumented immigrants, but only half. In fact, it's a slightly less than half from the most recent estimates. Whereas you have people from every other country in the world, some of whom, Central Americans maybe also crossed the border from El Salvador or Guatemala, but many of those folks came on an airplane and overstayed their visa. So when I did legal services with World Relief, I had clients who were undocumented from different parts of Africa, from the Philippines, from from Poland and the Chicagoland area where I work. It's a very diverse group of people. Canadians, there's people from everywhere who have overstayed a visa. And then most people who cross the border, of course, are from Mexico or Central America.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. So balancing this tension of secure borders but compassionate treatment and having a functional immigration system that promotes legal avenues and pathways to immigrate to the U.S. is a compassionate way to meet the needs of the most vulnerable neighbors that we have and those around the world.
Yeah, it's a compassionate way to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. And frankly, it's in our own interest as a country. The vast majority of economists will tell you that the United States has benefited enormously from immigration just on an economic level. And that's true of immigrants who came lawfully, but also immigrants who have not come lawfully, who work incredibly hard and are consumers and help grow a population that keeps an economy growing as well. So my view is let's shift as much as that possible to a legal immigration process, which is better for them and better for the society as a whole.
Thank you, Matthew. That is super helpful in understanding the nuances that surround all of this concerning border security. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.